It is a mark of an ungifted man to spend a great deal of time in what concerns his body, as in much exercise, much eating, much drinking, much evacuating of the bowels, much copulating. But these things are to be done in passing, and let your whole attention be devoted to the mind.
What Epictetus is telling us about in chapter 41 is pretty straightforward. You've got a contrast between the body, the soma, and what we're translating here as the mind, or literally the part of our mind that, sort of thinks about things, that makes judgments, the gnomen. And from a Stoic perspective, it's okay to take care of the body, but we shouldn't be obsessing about it, and that shouldn't be where our main attention is. And we'll use some examples of how that can be. Instead, we should be focusing on ourselves and the part of ourself that's most ourself, that is the higher faculty, the faculty of reason, the faculty of choice. What here he's talking about as the mind. So that's pretty straightforward and easy to grasp. The why question is what is likely to arise, I think, for many readers, especially when we look at some of the examples that he's bringing up. So we're going to work our way backwards rather than going directly through the text, and think about the last two that he brings up, evacuating of the bowels and copulating. If you're spending a lot of time engaging in sexual activities, then you're probably not going to be able to live the Stoic lifestyle. It's not to say that you wouldn't have any sex at all as a Stoic. He talks about that early on in the Enchiridion. But that shouldn't be the centerpiece of your existence. And it is for many people, and we'll come back to that in a moment. The whole, it's kind of funny to talk about evacuation of the bowels, but if you think about ancient medicine, it was concerned with what you took in and what went out. And we might extend this not only to those functions, but anything where we're concerned with what is, on the one hand, kind of, shameful or embarrassing, but on the other hand, things that people really do get quite interested in talking about and thinking about, what sort of deodorant do you wear? Do you pick out a whole range of them? We might go through a whole bunch of other examples of similar activities that people can get a little bit obsessive about. Now, he also talks about eating and drinking. People who spend a lot of time focused on food and drink. And the drink would be not just, drinking water or drinking sodas or juices, but drinking other things that we, find give us pleasure, like teas and coffees, alcoholic drinks. We could come up with all sorts of other instances as well. Now, again, those are things that are gratifying to the body. They're necessary as well. At least, drinking water is necessary. And eating a certain amount of good food is certainly beneficial to us. But we don't want to be centering our lives around, okay, when's the next meal? What's it going to look like? Is it going to have this kind of style to it? Just anticipating it. In short, we don't want to be what later on would be called gastronomes. Similarly, if we find that our day is ruined because we didn't get that special wine or beer or tea or blend of coffee that we were talking about, or if we're very fastidious about that sort of thing, if the coffee has to be done just like this, or otherwise it's no good, and perhaps we don't trust the restaurant, so we bring our own little bag of coffee around. I've seen people doing this sort of thing a little obsessively. That's really, verging on a problem as far as the Stoics are concerned. What about exercise? You might say, exercise, how can you go against that? It's good for the body, right? You're building yourself up. Well, from the Stoic perspective, although Epictetus does use a lot of metaphors from athletic competition and things like that, he says you shouldn't be spending too much time and too much attention on athletics, on training, on what they have in the Greek as Gymnastistai, that's the verb for to engage in physical activities. If you're doing that obsessively, then you're probably not paying attention to what's more important, which is the you, the mind, the thing that is at the core of who you are. Your body is something external. So people, for example, who get very obsessive about, they get into biking and now they have to go on this trek and that trek and they have to tinker with their bikes all the time and make sure that their stance is just right and talk with everybody else about it to the point where you're like, oh, come on, I don't want to hear any more about your biking. Or people who get into swimming that way. Or people who get into running. Running is particularly bad that way. People, talk about the latest race that they did. And all of these things are ways of focusing on the body and its activities, which is okay, but going a bit too far and ignoring the things that are closer to us, the things that are in some ways more lasting than our body, the things that are more determinative. Because what decides what your body does? It's your mind. So the Stoics think that that's where we should have our focus.
When someone treats you ill or speaks ill of you, remember that he acts or speaks thus because he thinks it incumbent upon him. That being the case, it is impossible for him to follow what appears good to you, but what appears good to himself. Whence it follows that if he gets a wrong view of things, the man that suffers is the man that has been deceived. For if a person thinks a true composite judgment to be false, the composite judgment does not suffer, but the person who has been deceived. If, therefore, you start from this point of view, you will be gentle with the man who reviles you, for you should say on each occasion, he thought that way about it.
Chapter 42 is about how we ought to deal with people who wind up being difficult for us, and perhaps because they're difficult people to begin with. You can watch how they interact with other people, or perhaps there's some sort of particular conflict with us. Maybe we push their buttons, or they push our buttons. There's a personality conflict of some sort, or they don't like the kind of person that they think that we are, anything along those lines. So Epictetus talks about two ways in which people negatively affect us. At least, this is how we look at it. He says, when somebody treats you ill or speaks ill of you, right? So the Greek there is kakos poiein. Poiein can mean doing anything. So, not opening the door for you and letting it close in your face, flipping you the bird, cutting you off in traffic, all the way to like undermining you when you have to make the big presentation, or, sweeping in and taking something that you're competing for. All of that could fit under there. And then the other is kakos lege, meaning when that person says things badly, says things that are bad about you or in relation to you. They bring up your flaws. They point out, they make some criticism pointing out something about you in front of other people who are going to take it to heart and who, you're going to get embarrassed as a result of it. Or perhaps it's going to damage your reputation or lose you a client or whatever we want to think of here. He says, when somebody does this, when they speak it badly or they do something bad to you, remember that this person acts or speaks that way because they think that it is incumbent upon them. They think that that's what they ought to do. Literally here it's kathekein, and that's the word that the Stoics use for duty or obligation. They think that this is the way that they should behave, and if they don't act that way, they're not doing what they're supposed to do. So they may be totally mistaken about that, but they are acting that way because they think that that's in some respect the right thing for them to do. So he says, that being the case, it's impossible for this person to follow what appears good to you, but he has to follow what appears good to himself. So we have a conflict here. You don't like being treated that way. You see that as something bad for you. That person may see it as partly bad, like, when we impose a punishment on somebody who we actually care about, we're not happy to impose the punishment, but we feel that it has to be done. Or when we stand up against somebody, we say, look, you're screwing up. I didn't want to have to tell you this, but you're really messing up this situation, right? When we do that, we can recognize that we are doing it because we feel that it's the right thing to do. We say we have good intentions in doing it, right? We can see the same thing in another person who is doing it. And they may be screwed up in multiple ways. It may be that they think that they're an important person, so they get to talk down to everybody and boss them around and kick them around if possible, in which case they're in error, right? They have an erroneous conception of how people ought to behave in relation to each other. But by pointing out the fact that you think they're treating you wrong, you're not going to change their mind. The only thing that will change their mind is something happening on their end. Now, you can't, of course, oppose them and try to make it painful for them to behave in that way, but there's only so many cases where you can do that in our lives. So he says, it follows, if a person gets a wrong view of things, the person that suffers is the one who has been deceived. This is very difficult for us to hear, and this is also very difficult for us to put into place, because when somebody talks to us or about us in ways that we don't like, or they act in relation to us in ways that we don't like, it's hard for us not to think that we're being hurt or our interests aren't being damaged. But if we take a Stoic point of view, we can see that they're not actually affecting what's deep inside of us, the core of our personality. They're not affecting our faculty of choice. They can't, right? They're using their own faculty of choice. We have our own. They can affect your body. They can affect your reputation. They can lose you clients. They can, cause people to not want to call you up, or, maybe they drop you on social media or anything along those lines. But they can't affect you at the core of who you are. And when they behave in this way, acting like jerks, essentially, it's because they have a fundamentally screwed up point of view. And who does that fundamentally screwed up point of view harm? Primarily them. Because it's actually bad to be out of touch with reality and to substitute some imaginary projection in place of reality. And if you observe these people, you're generally going to see them running into problems with other people, similarly to your own case. So he goes on and he says, here's an example. If a person thinks a true composite judgment, right, where we're putting two things together, to be false, the composite judgment does not suffer. The truth doesn't suffer. That person suffers. The truth is what it is. And the truth is, the truth of a statement is what it is, regardless of whether I believe it or not. If I don't believe it, well, I'm the one who's in error then, right? I'm not hurting the truth by not believing it. As a matter of fact, the only person I'm hurting is myself, and perhaps other people if I can get them to believe my erroneous viewpoint on things, right? So he says, if you can take this point of view, then you're going to be gentle, is how it's translated here. The term there is praus. And in the ancient Greek, this is a term that is used as the opposite for states of anger. So calm would be another way of talking about it. You're not going to take offense at the person. Another way of translating it in religious literature is meek. Praus means meek in the New Testament. Here we're translating it as gentle or good-tempered or something along those lines. You're not going to fly off the handle at this person who is in fact behaving like a jerk, because you realize that they can't help themselves on some level. They could help themselves by getting correct information about how the world works and about their own behavior, but in the situation that they're in at the moment when they're hurting you, they're kind of acting automatically like a jerk, to be sure, but automatically. And if they could step back and realize what's going on, they would, in fact, if they're rational, choose to do otherwise. So he says, that's how you can deal with these people, on every occasion, you can say, he thought that way about it. That's the way it appears to him. That's the opinion, that's the viewpoint that person has and brings to the situation. So it's understandable why they behave that way. Notice that this is not to require you to forgive the person. This doesn't require you to excuse the person. This doesn't require you to condone their actions. You can call a bad action, but you can also be understanding of the fact that it doesn't appear bad to them, and it doesn't appear bad to them precisely because there's something screwed up in the way in which they view things.
Everything has two handles, by one of which it ought to be carried, and by the other not. If your brother wrongs you, do not lay hold of the matter by the handle of the wrong that he is doing, because this is the handle by which the matter ought not to be carried, but rather by the other handle, that he is your brother, and that you were brought up together, and then you will be laying hold of the matter by the handle by which it ought to be carried.
Chapter 43 is quite a famous passage, and it's very useful to keep in mind. This is one of those dogmata that you can keep, sort of stored in the back of your mind and think about maybe once a day, just so you like a tool, you keep it ready at hand for use and in good condition. And then when you get into a situation, you bring it out and you say it to yourself to remind yourself of how you can behave in a situation. So it's a lovely thought that he's got here. Everything has two handles, one of which it can be carried by, the other of which it cannot be carried by. So imagine a bag or a vase or anything else. And it's got two handles, and one of the handles is very rough and kind of shifts around. And you've got some weight in that bag or that receptacle. And the other handle is well set. You can pick it up, you can carry it around that way. Things in life are like that, except what the handles are viewpoints about the situations that we get in and the people who are acting in them. So the example that he gives here, and we could come up with many, many other similar examples, is if your brother wrongs you, and notice he says, your brother wrongs you, he does do something wrong to you, do not lay hold of the matter by the handle of the wrong that he is doing. That's one that you can't carry it by. He says, you shouldn't carry it by this handle, but you're not going to be able to do that anyway. What's going to happen if you focus on that particular handle? You're going to get angry. You're going to get depressed. You're going to be fearful of your brother. You're going to be resentful, bury it down deep inside, and it comes out in passive-aggressive ways. None of these are good for you. None of these are things that are good for you as a person, because these are all negative emotions that, as a Stoic, you would want to gradually analyze and remove from your psyche, from your array of feelings. Not to say that you can't feel anything. The Stoics did recognize some feelings as being good, but those are not among them for the Stoics. It's also not going to help you deal with your brother. Your brother is not going to be made any better by you getting angry at him and shouting and storming out or issuing threats or, getting him back later on with a practical joke in a passive-aggressive way. Your brother is not going to be improved by you avoiding him, by you sulking, by any of these sorts of things, by you posting stuff on social media about, your family, whether you come straight out and call them out or whether you do what they call vague booking, where you just say some things and let people draw their own conclusions. None of that is going to be helpful. That's the wrong handle by which to grasp it. So how should you grasp it? He says, you can grasp it by this handle, that he is your brother, and that you were brought up together, and then you will be laying hold of the matter by the handle by which it ought to be carried. It ought to be carried by that handle, because if you remind yourself of these sorts of things, then you will be able to look at your brother as somebody who you have a certain relationship with that you want to preserve, a relationship that comes with certain obligations on your part, even if that jerk isn't fulfilling the obligations on his own part. You have a choice about which handle you want to grasp these things by. This is a very powerful reminder. Quite often, we feel as if we only have one handle. I can only grasp it by this. We forget that we do have a choice, that we ourselves are involved in the situation. We look at the situation in a passive way, as if it's just completely impinging on us. It just is what it is, and we have to accept that, even though we might not accept what we don't like in the situation. We have a choice in how we frame the situation to ourselves and where we place the emphasis as far as our own actions, as far as our own thoughts, as far as our own choices, as far as our own comportments towards other people. That's the choice for the other handle. We have to remind ourselves that there is this other handle, or else it's not going to come to mind immediately for us. This is a very important part of Stoic practice. So this can be quite useful to remember that there's two handles to everything. Everything, Epictetus is saying. Everything has two handles. One handle we can't grasp it by, we can't carry it by, we can't endure it by. The other handle is well suited to that. This is sort of a reminder that the universe is not out there to get us, and we have the capacity to intervene positively in ways that will help us make progress on our path.